So our first session of the day is Genesis of DSP at Rice and DSP in general, and our master of ceremonies for this initial session is Jeff Orsak of the Moody Innovation Institute in Dallas. So let's give it up.
That's impressive. It is good to be back at Rice in a new building, but old faces. And you still look good, everyone. Congratulations. It's fantastic to be here. I'm just thrilled. This session, I think, when I was thinking about it, and Rich asked me to MC the session, the only thing you can really do is just introduce the speakers and then get out of the way. They're about as good as they get. Reminds me of the 1920 Yankees. It's baseball season. I don't know if you follow baseball, but the first 6 hitters of the 1920 Yankees were called Murderers Row. And that's what we have, our very own DSP Murderers Row for you this morning. So let me introduce the speakers if I can. Sidney Burrus. Would you like for him to come up?
Yeah.
Okay. Why don't you come on up to the front? Al Oppenheim and Ron Schaefer. The opening question really is, where were you in 1969?
Execute the office
of President of the United States.
And he may go! He's in there! Stop.
Question, why our troops were still fighting and dying in Vietnam. Over 1 million people demonstrated in every state of the nation.
Picking of the birthdays for the draft.
Later, Spruill makes his 3rd TD of the day as Rice triumphs 30.
It says, students and faculty alike have long been proud of the community that is Rice University. That has been a community composed of students, faculty, and administration, acting together with honesty and good faith.
Liftoff on Apollo 11.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well, Dr. Burrus will be taking over as of July 1st.
There's an instance of the ARPANET as it was recently configured. 25 were 30 sites in it.
Man. And in fact, the impact of digital technology is rather dramatic, and the indications are that it will be even.
There's a fly ball hit out to the left, waiting is Joe, world champion.
How to get to Sesame.
Compare it with a 707 jetliner.
Fred Trump understands he's a real New Yorker too. And that's what he wants. Fred Trump. He's for us.
It's rather shocking to look out there and see people from a few days ago and people from half a century ago. It is remarkable, absolutely remarkable. What I used to be asked to give talks on my recent research results. Now I'm generally asked to give talks on history. And that has been going on. It was explained that the color of my hair gave me some kind of authority. However, I will try to do that, and this term genesis is a little bit presumptuous, but in another way, it is setting. I am going to back up to 1965 when I came to Rice from Stanford and tell you a little bit about my response to that world that existed there. A lot of it was very personal. When I was hired, there were two other people hired, and they both had greater experience and greater expertise than I did in some areas I was interested. So I was disappointed that I need to choose my plan B or maybe even plan C because plan A was already in place. A couple of years later, when we hired Tom Parks, he had some similar frustrations, and so the two of us decided that the future was, in fact, digital, and we put together something that only in retrospect can you see made sense. At the time, you did what was in front of your face. So in 1965, when I finished my thesis, you couldn't believe how good the world was. Every university in the country was trying to build up their program in research. And here I was getting my PhD at Stanford, and everybody wanted to come to my university and do what Stanford did. And I was just desperately trying to finish my thesis. I ended up with a choice, my own personal choice, between Bell Labs up in not in New Jersey, but up in Massachusetts, I think, and Rice. And I decided if I went to academics, I could more easily move out of it if it didn't work than I could to move into it if I later wanted to. So I went to Rice. In 1965, this remarkable paper was published by Cooley and Tukey on the fast Fourier transform, or it became the fast Fourier transform. And then I later got to know Jim Cooley fairly well, and an absolutely remarkable man, a charming man, with a fascinating story. And then I later learned that there was this, I'm not sure there was a star in the sky, but nonetheless, there was a birth that year that ended up and Rich Baradock, somewhere out in the wilds of Canada, was born. So those three happenings ended up being fortuitous. I think all of you know that in those early days, digital signal processing was kind of like the transistor to the vacuum tube. It was a little thing that was specialized and would work in certain areas and would never be big, but it was going to be important. Everybody knew it was going to be important. The military had money, they had tough problems, and the digital signal processing could do things the analog signal processing couldn't. Healthcare. You know, you're dying and you don't want to die, so you'll go digital, not analog. And the oil industry needs to find oil. Seismic signal processing, big deal. Some of you may know Texas Instruments. The instruments part was for instrumentation in the energy industry. So those three industries had money. And to start a new research program, you always need money. There are two happenings in the history of my kind of DSP that were paradigm shifters. The first was the FFT by Cooley and Tukey. The second was the Parks-McClellan algorithm. Those were two that took an existing important problem and just moved it forward by a huge margin and changed the world. The same way the telescope did in astronomy for, Galileo, and the microscope did in biology, just the world changing. Once you had the FFT, you could solve problems you couldn't even imagine before. Once you had the Parks-McClellan algorithm, you could design filters, length 2,000 if you wanted, whatever. Do it on your laptop computers, which of course didn't exist in those days. But those two items I've generally used as my benchmarks, and particularly the FFT, because it's a great story of how research moves forward in strange and mysterious ways. The combination of information theory and computation that came out of World War II stage when Shannon's work and Cooley and Tukey's work, the von Neumann architect, just the whole scene there, it was just sitting. And so Tom Parks and I said, that's our future. And I had done a thesis in circuit theory and taught a course in network synthesis, bot-duffing, I mean, all kinds of strange and completely useless and so I can either stay on the end of that trajectory, or I could get on this new one, and I didn't know where that was going. Tom and I had a lot in common, and we had a lot of things that were very different. From an organizational point of view, there were some meetings. I learned from Tom, who had done his master's thesis from Hans Schussler, who was on leave from Erlangen in Germany to Cornell. Tom did his master's thesis, and he said, you need to meet Schussler. So at the Ardent House in 1972, Tom and I went up to the Ardent House, and I met a number of people, Charlie Rader, people that I later ended up knowing well, but at that time I met them and said, you know, we're doing digital signal processing down at Rice, and they smiled and said, you know, good luck. We had some good luck, as it turns out. My original IEEE connection was with the circuit theory group. There was also another group on audio. There were a number of other IEEE groups, but the one on circuit theory seemed to fit my interest best. Well, over the years, though, that evolved from circuit theory into the modern Circuits and Systems Society. And the audio one evolved into what is now the Signal Processing Society. This Ardent House, and some of you know some of the history of the Ardent House. It's in Harriman, New York, outside of New York City. Wonderful facility for small conferences. So we met there. The entire community in the world in signal processing, you know, met in this small little facility and had a great time. That's when some of the real visions sort of came to mine and Tom's mind, and we took back to Rice and to our graduate students the ideas that we picked up there. Funding. To have research, you've got to have funding. And the National Science Foundation, we ended up, John, where are you? John Cousins, where? Okay. John, who was your predecessor at NSF in signal processing? Do you remember?
I can't remember the name of the individual.
Yeah.
It was between me and Schussler.
Yeah.
But
and
that was in a different division as well, Schussler.
But NSF took up some leadership, and
He came from Cincinnati.
The NSF picked up leadership that others didn't. DARPA also gave leadership in signal processing research. The NIH later did medical applications, and the various military groups pumped a fair amount of money in a interesting sort of way. But we were lucky to have funding sources that a lot of other areas did not. The semiconductor industry saw DSP as a moneymaker. And particularly Texas Instruments built these specialized microprocessors that fit the needs of signal processing and made them a commodity. So it wasn't just the high-end applications. Pretty soon, DSP chips were in toys. They were in all sorts of things, and now they're embedded, in some cases, they're embedded in people. So you have signal processors stuck in your aorta or something. But the industry gave us this background. So you began to see with the intellectual ferment, the society backing, the funding sources, the industrial involvement, the potential markets that were out there, that it was indeed a perfect storm. We had all the elements in place to do what we have seen done. Well, when I retired, my friend said, "Why are you still teaching? Why are you still going to the university? When you retire, you can do what you've always wanted to do." I was doing what I always wanted to do, so they didn't kick me out. So I was allowed to stick around and teach ancient stuff. So other universities that I got to know fairly well, and in the beginning, I worked with people at MIT, Princeton, and Colorado, the four universities that kind of interchange, Rice, MIT, Princeton, and Colorado. Rather quickly, though, the group at Georgia Tech that you'll hear some about, Rhode Island and Illinois, and then several other places. And after a while, there was signal processing everywhere. But in the beginning, it wasn't. And that was fun. We taught short courses, we wrote books, we wrote papers. It was so good it hurt. We developed new curricula. And of course, each of us had an idea about how that should go. A little bit later, several of us, the three of us, but who else was on the Casper project?
Well, there was Jim.
Jim McClellan, yeah.
Yeah, and Hans, wasn't Andy Singer?
No.
Andy?
No. Tom Parks, yeah. There were six of us. And with perhaps the exception of Ron Schaefer, the rest of us had some very strong feelings and wanted to tell the others how it should be done. who got along with everybody, and the rest of us were a little bit on the prickly side. But a bunch of us headstrong teachers trying to develop an educational project together. But we did it. And it was a little bit piecemeal, but it was actually quite good and great fun. You got courses, you got faculty, you got to have books. The first book that I remember using was one by Quo and Kaiser, or Kaiser and Quo, and it had chapters, one of them being one that interested me a lot on filter design in 1966. Then a more complete book came out by Gold and Rader in 1969, but it was 1975 that sort of the textbook happening occurred when two books were published. The first one, Al and Ron here authored, and that book has gone on through about 4 editions now, 3 or 4 editions, yeah. And has remained sort of the gold standard.
That's a sore point. The 4th edition hasn't come out yet.
It is the gold standard, and literally was gold colored.
The 3rd is actually the 4th, right? Because
then a variety of other books, right. As people learned how to teach and had developed their own styles and technologies. Now, those were comments about DSP in general. I'd like to talk more particularly about Rice. As President Leland pointed out, there was a time in history when Rice decided to go from being primarily an undergraduate institution to being a graduate and research university. And the board of trustees hired a president who would make that leadership. He hired other people, one of them being the chairman of electrical and computer engineering, who in turn hired faculty. The year I came, some of you remember Boyd Pearson in control theory, Rui deFigueredo in communication and later signal processing, and me. And Boyd and Rui were more senior. And it kind of intimidated me, but I was determined to find my place in things. In '67, we hired Tom Parks from Cornell, who had done his master's thesis under Schuessler, and Tom and I decided we were going to do DSP, went to the Ardent House and got things rolling there. But Tom and I, in some ways, thought in a very, very similar ways, and in other ways, we're very, very different people. But the collaborative environment at Rice meant that I worked with Tom's students, and my student worked with Tom. So several of you here who, in fact, did their PhD under Tom, I co-published papers with them, and my students with Tom. So it was very much a family, and people tried to include others as much as possible. But in either 68 or 69, Tom and I taught our first course in DSP. And that was, it was great fun. And we pieced together a course that the remnants of it you can still see in the course I just taught this past semester. As you can imagine, it's becoming a little bit obsolete. Tom and I both took sabbatical leaves at various times. I had spent 2 years in Germany with Schuessler in Erlangen, and I think one other, Ivan Selesnik. You spent a year with Schuessler in Germany, I remember. Very important year, and Schuessler is a very important guy. I got to know him fairly well. Peter Rayner at Cambridge in England. The FFT guy in France who, anyway, there's some people in France who were doing some good algorithm work, and in Italy down in Florence. So there's an interesting international group that knew each other, and we travel and go to conferences and go to each other's institutions. In 1977, we hired Don Johnson, and Don brought a variety of new skills. One of the most important, he could bring up Unix on our PDP. And everybody loved that. That was just in the early days of Unix, and it made the PDP-11 a useful computer. We had a wizard with Don, who also did a little DSP on the side. Then somewhere along in there, I reconnected with an old classmate of mine, Bill Sick, who had gone after graduation from Rice as undergraduates. He had gone to Texas Instruments, had moved up the ladder to Texas Instruments into administrative positions, and was a senior vice president at TI. And TI was, at that days, the DSP company in the country. So Bill and I thought that Rice and TI would make great partners in collaboration, and so we started that. It turns out then that TI started working with MIT and Georgia Tech, and so the three of us worked with, let's see, Gene France, are you around here somewhere? Gene, Bill Sick at Texas Instruments, and ended up with a collaboration that I never have seen one quite like it, where the universities were working with each other and TI rather than competing against each other for TI. And in so many cases, you're courting the favor of a particular industry, and you try to elbow your academic colleagues out of the way because you want to be there first. And the dollar that goes to you won't go to them. With our little collaborative group, that wasn't the way it worked. And so we worked together, I think, quite well to develop a relationship with TI. 2001, Mike Orchard came to Rice, and he had been at, I guess, Mike, where you do your PhD?
Illinois and Princeton.
Is it a PhD at Illinois? Yeah. And then came to Rice, I think, for a year as a visiting faculty member, and then stayed on, moved permanently to Rice, primarily in image processing, but in a lot of other areas in signal processing as well. I'm particularly sorry that two people, mainly Tom Parks, because he was so important to our program here at Rice and so important to everybody in this room, who's he ended up with a nice membership in the National Academy. A big part of that came from the Parks-McClellan algorithm, and we're lucky enough to have Jim McClellan with us, but unfortunately Tom could not make it. Jim, where are you? Could you make a couple of comments about your experiences with Tom? Second best to having Tom here. We'll just have.
All right, I'm no good at extemporaneous speaking, so I don't know where this will go. Tom was amazing, and let me just kind of say the important thing first. It's hard for me to imagine running into somebody who you just automatically work with so well. As I was getting ready for this, I went back and read a little paper that he and I published in the Signal Processing magazine the year after we got the Kilby Medal, and it was entitled A Personal History of the Parks-McClellan Algorithm. And the idea that jumped out of that when I read it is the fact that I really considered him the idea man, or the muse that gave me these interesting things to chase down when I was a brand new graduate student. And the fact that they worked out so well, was just amazing. The other thing about Tom was, he and I think, became friends during my first year in graduate school. And I don't know how all of you who have PhDs had a graduate experience, with your advisor and how that worked out. But there was something about the way we got along. I don't know if he was like my big brother or something like that, but we would talk for hours in his office during the first couple of years I was in graduate school. He knew a lot about cars. He and Sidney used to talk about cars all the time. Like a typical graduate student, I had car problems from time to time that I couldn't pay for and stuff like that. Later on, when I was leaving MIT and trying to figure out what to do, he had gotten involved with Schlumberger, and I think that connection was part of what drew me back to this area to work with Schlumberger. Later on, this book that Sidney referenced kind of grew out of the fact that we were all using MATLAB, and we were, as a result, teaching courses on MATLAB, and he and I developed this set of courses that we would give at various places, and spent a lot of time going back and forth on the phone and email and the like, developing those courses. So just throughout my entire career, I think he's been had been such a mentor and all of that. And like Sidney, I really wish I would see him again, wish he could have been here. But he certainly made the Rice experience tremendous in my life. So thank you.
That relationship of a PhD student and an advisor is a very special one, and I'm sure every person here who's been a part, either the advisor or the advisee, has your own story, and they're all quite different. And I just glancing up there and seeing Tom Barnwell and Mark Smith, and just thinking, yes, they had a nice relationship with interesting stories come out of their collaboration. Let me, one last comment, that in my fairly senior years, one of my colleagues in the math department told me I should look into the application of wavelets to signal processing. And I looked at him and said, no. They're ugly. They're not solutions to differential equations. They're no, they're not the eigenfunction of anything. No. So I walked away from that. And then finally, my insistent friend, Ronnie Wells, said, no, you've got to look at these. And so I did a bit more and thought, oh my goodness. My fascination and my admiration for Fourier analysis had sort of blinded me to this characteristics that come out of a different place. So the power that I brought, and intuition that I brought out of Fourier had sort of prevented me from seeing some of the stuff that wavelets could do. And so then I really jumped into the wavelets. But if you've got 2 points, you can then start extrapolating and realize, well, if I've been fooled once, I can probably be fooled again. So before I decide that wavelets are the answer, maybe there's always that next step out there that wavelets, yeah, they're great, but there's something else or a different way of formulating. And so I began to not trust you fall in love with the last person that you kissed. Be careful. Be careful. But wavelets were great. I taught a short course at an ICASP, ended up turning that into a book that has done quite well. Tom Robbins, I don't know if Tom came, he was an editor at that time in Prentice, Addison Wesley, I think, who then moved to another company and ended up at National Instruments. An alternative way to develop wavelets came out of Georgia Tech with Smith and Barnwell, and so it's great to have them here, because for a long time I thought, well, that's one kind of niche way to look at wavelets, but the vector space way is definitely the best way to do it. They somehow saw just the other way around, until we finally began to realize that actually we were doing the same thing, and that there were 2 different ways of looking at wavelets that each gave insight that the other kind of covered up. And what you need to do is know both, not one or the other. And there's still other ways that I hope will end up being developed. Here is at some ICASP, and I wasn't able to figure out which one it was, but there's Tom Parks in the blue shirt on your left, and Martha Parks in the foreground there. There I am on the right, and my wife Mary Lee over in the very far right, just sort of peeking out on the edge. And there's Al Oppenheim sitting adjacent to me. Now, I think this was a DSP workshop in Central Texas back several years ago.
You organized it, right?
Yeah. Okay.
That was the beer cart.
What? No, okay, here you, is that Ed Lee? I think so. I believe that's right here, Ed Lee. Mark is in there, yeah, there's Mark. There's Gene France over here in the far left. Is that Buck? Is that your?
I can't see it.
Okay. Anyway, you'll see a number of Rice folks. I keep poking on your keyboard here, Rich. Wondering why it wasn't working. Jan Odegaard, Sally Wood, John Treichler, Gene France, Ed Lee, Jim McClellan, Doug Jones. Doug, are you here? Good to see you. Mark again. John Treichler, Gene France, telling something. Jan, Faye Boudreau, Laura. There. Good to see you. I think I will now turn it over to Al.
In terms of the genesis of DSP, I have to say that my thoughts go back a couple of thousand years, and meaning I think that that DSP kind of started when time series analysis started, but in the 60s there was clearly a big bang, and what I think kind of triggered this kind of big bang was that computers, rather, while they still sort of fill the room, were at least priced and fast enough so that you could do non-real-time processing on fairly sophisticated processing on data. And so there were people like Treitel and Robinson and at MIT that were working with geophysical data. And then at MIT, there were, for example, Tom Stockham, who was using the TX0, working with Amar Bose to simulate room acoustics and to do a lot of offline processing using that kind of computer. And at the same time, there were people at Lincoln Laboratory who were obviously interested in building analog systems, but using the computers to simulate the analog systems to tune the parameters. And Ben and Charlie were using the TX2 and doing, for example, digital filtering and building filter banks. And of course, none of this was real time. It was typically like not 10 times real time or a tenth of real time. It was 100 or 1,000, but it was all offline. Now, for me personally, I kind of got involved in DSP as I was finishing up my doctoral thesis. My advisor was Amar Bose. Tom Stockham was on my committee. And as soon as I finished my PhD, which was on nonlinear systems and nonlinear signal processing, I joined Ken Stevens' group, and Ken's interest was, and group had to do with speech, speech processing. And what jumped out at me was a really terrific application of the rather abstract ideas I had in my doctoral thesis on deconvolution, and kind of got involved with that. And then there was this lanky kid from Nebraska who came wandering into my office looking for a PhD thesis, and that was one of the really fortunate things that happened for me, which was this just wonderful collaboration with Ron, and we pursued using the ideas from my thesis to do deconvolution, and we just had a wonderful time. Now in '67, I went out to Lincoln on a 2-year leave of absence. Actually, let me be honest and say I went out to Lincoln because I was told by my department head that there was no chance that I could get tenure at MIT. So, and it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. I went out to Lincoln and working with Tom and Ben and Charlie. And then there was the Big Bang, which was the Cooley-Tukey paper, Ardent House, and then I went back to MIT in '69. Happened that Don Johnson was a summer student at Lincoln, and when I started that DSP course, of course it was a new course, I needed a TA, but there wasn't a TA. but Don was the first TA, and also, of course, he was taking the course for credit. So I would have Don make up the exams, and then, of course, I had to grade his exam. Now, just a couple of pictures from those days. This is a picture of Tom Stockham on the left, Charlie Rader on the right, and I'm sure everybody knows what's on the board there, which is the signal flow graph for a radix 2 FFT algorithm. The thing is that it was Tom and Charlie that really came up with that. And it took a lot of decoding of the Cooley-Tukey paper to figure out that this is what's going on. And of course, that's one of the sort of famous signal flow graphs. I have to say, by the way, that Charlie Rader was just visiting my group last week with this great new idea that Charlie has, and that's the kind of guy that Charlie was and is, these crazy ideas that aren't so crazy, that he's not sure of what they're good for, but they often turn out to be good for things. So I just kind of want to, and this is Jim Cooley at Ardent House. I just want to show a couple of pictures of the hardware that we used, and so this is the TX0. This is the TX2. And a couple of points I want to make about this. First of all, working with on the TX0, the TX2, and then some of those other computers, there was not time sharing. So, and 64K of memory was a lot of memory. And here's what the memory looks like. So this is one bit plane of a 64K ferrite core memory. And that bit plane is about this size wide and this size high. And you can see sort of down in the right-hand corner, well, you can look at that picture and you can see the individual bits because each ferrite core is a bit. Another thing about these computers, because there was no time sharing, basically you signed up for a half hour of computer time. And if you really wanted to get some serious stuff done, that meant you really worked at night. This is the a computer that, I don't know if Don, did you work on the 1219 at Lincoln? Yeah, okay. So the Univac 1219 was a militarized version of this computer. And actually, one of the kind of points I want to make about it, because of the fact that there was no time sharing and background jobs and things like that, to run 2 seconds worth of speech took at least an hour, running FFTs and so on. And you have to do this at night. So what I would do is call up my wife on the phone, and she'd leave the phone off the hook. I'd leave the phone off the hook in the computer room. And then I would get the program running, and we had a speaker attached to one bit of the accumulator. And so while I was home having dinner, I could listen to what part of the program actually the program was in. And here's another very interesting thing that actually Charlie Rader did. He did a speech spectrogram of the FFT running. You know what it looks like? Looks like an FFT flow graph. Try it. You'll be amazed. Now, as I looked at the Univac 1219, I had to think ahead to the iPhone and where we are today, 50 years later. And I'm sort of struck by the fact that in the iPhone processor, there's 3 billion transistors, that IBM has a chip the size of a fingernail that has 80 billion transistors on it. pretty amazing as you do the math sort of going forward. I guess there's a key point I want to make about the old days that's sort of captured in this slide. So quite often, when people talk to me, to Ron, to Sid, to Jim, people from the sort of quote old days, they say, boy, you guys were just in the right place at the right time. My response to that is everyone is always in exactly the right place at the right time. The question is, do you recognize the opportunity in front of you? So this slide I like because this will also work 50 years from now. Basically, the bolt of lightning is where we were in the 60s, just at the right time, place at the right time. Something was exponentially increasing, something else was exponentially decreasing, the lines were crossing, there we were. Today, we're all in exactly the right place at the right time. Do we recognize what's sitting in front of us? Thank you very much.
I thought that being early in the program, I would be able to say something original, but apparently not.
Ron, your mic, I think, is upside down.
Oh, really? It is.
Yeah.
But means I have to put it over here. Okay. Well, DSP technology is certainly a magnificent creation of human beings, and many people were involved, many businesses, many universities. And I think that it's fair to say that Rice University has been a leader over the past 50 years, and I congratulate you. Now, we have this metaphor of Genesis here. I'm not sure whether that was picked so that we just talk about the beginning, or whether it's more like when we first tasted the forbidden fruit. In any case, let me proceed. Rich said that we should talk about the pressing problems that motivated the development of DSP and what factors converged to make it possible. And you've already heard a lot about that, so I'll try and move quickly. The pressing problems, were they really pressing, or for me, I think, and many people, the great motivation was that it was really fun. Where else could you find something, as the president said this morning, that combines math and computers and interesting applications? And that's what digital signal processing is all about. Oppenheim often talks about solutions looking for problems, and I think that may be a good characterization of DSP. It turned out to be a good solution to many problems, many solutions that were only dreamed of 50 years ago. And as Sid has pointed out, and others, the AT&T, oil companies, defense labs, and so forth were all interested. And but the bottom line is you need a signal to do signal processing. So it always was couched in applications. Now, I came up with a big list here of factors you can be reading while I'm talking, but I think we can say that the early work of Shannon and Nyquist at Bell Labs, talking about sampling and representing signals in digital form, pulse code modulation, and so on, was the basis for what we ended up being able to do in the 60s when things started happening. Al has mentioned the importance of accessibility of hands-on computers, and I think that was a very important part. Of course, as others have mentioned, the FFT in 1965 brought the frequency domain actually into the implementation domain. And the major players at that time in the 60s and early and 70s were MIT, Lincoln Labs, Bell Telephone Labs, and IBM Research. That's not to say that other people weren't doing interesting and useful things, but there was a kind of core group of people that really captured the Audio and Electroacoustic Society of IEEE and found a home there for disseminating the ideas. And then finally in the 70s, VLSI technology came on and made it all possible to quit talking about theory and simulations and actually doing things. And you've seen these pictures, this picture before. The Ardent House was a real focus for the early dissemination of information. You have to remember, there was no internet. There was no easy downloading of PDF files. It was personal interactions that really made the thing work. Here's the famous paper that's been alluded to, the abstract. As Al mentioned, I went looking for a PhD thesis, and I talked to Tom Stockham and Al, and they said that I should go over to the PDP-1 computer and write a program for it. And so I went looking for the PDP-1 computer. It's famous for other things as basically the birthplace of video games. You're seeing here a space war going on. But the thing to remember about things at that time were that these hands-on computers were not particularly easy to use. You programmed in machine language. At least at MIT, DSP researchers were hardcore. We didn't mess around with Fortran or anything like that. So this is my attempt at a program for the FFT. Well, I did manage to complete a PhD thesis, and I moved to Bell Telephone Laboratories. I was fortunate to join the group of Jim Flanagan, and already working there was Larry Rabiner, who became one of my closest friends and colleagues for all these years. Again, here's a hands-on computer lab. There was a person, George Sperling at Bell Labs at the time, who wrote a memo that said that these kind of computers were great, but the key to making good use of them is never to get in a position of managing them, because that would eat up all of your time. And I tried to follow that throughout my career and always find a computer that somebody else was taking care of. Now, Larry had a close connection with Tom Parks and Jim McClellan through his interest in optimum filter design, and they wrote a number of papers together. Another person at Bell Labs at that time was Jim Kaiser. This is the abstract of his famous paper on windowing, although it looks like it's just a paper on digital filters. Jim worked in a group that was exploring how digital signal processing might be used in the telephone system. This was the Bell system, if anybody remembers that. It was headed by Hank McDonald, they were mainly trying to develop demonstration systems. So they were putting together actual hardware digital filters with discrete components. Another person in that group was Leland Jackson, who did a lot of the hardware work. And he left and he joined a company called Rockland Filter Rockland Systems, and they were a company that made variable analog filters, and he made perhaps the first digital filter product. It was 4 second-order sections that could be programmed. And for the price of a small house, you could have one of these. Another thing going on at Bell Labs and other places was the processing of speech using digital processing. Attal and Schroeder wrote a definitive paper, and Attal later. And then other people around the country, John Markle and Steen Gray in California, and John McCool at BBN in Boston, and Fumitada Itakura. These kind of ideas were floating around, and they came together in various people's minds in different ways. And then I moved from Bell Labs to Georgia Tech. I was struck by the parallel that was brought of the talk that the president gave here about how important DSP was in Rice's evolution from an undergraduate institution to a world-class research institution. That same thing happened at Georgia Tech, and I share credit with many, many people for the fact that digital signal processing was a key to many of the advancements that brought Georgia Tech from the ranks of a regional engineering school with a catchy fight song to a world-class research university. So when I got to Georgia Tech, Tom Barnwell was there. And I have to say that there are 2 engineers that stand out in my mind, Tom Stockham and Tom Barnwell, both Toms, were both the kind of people who could make things happen, hardware and software, but they also could do theory with the best. And I feel greatly fortunate to have been able to know and work with both of those people. This was a Data General computer that Tom had put together with great blood, sweat, and tears. Later on, we got fancier equipment. Russ Mercereau joined us the next year after I was there, and then we were joined by Mark Clements and Monty Hayes and Jim McClellan and a bunch more MIT and Bell Labs and Rice graduates and people like Mark Smith from our own program. Let's see, who else is here? Doug Williams. And it turned out to be an exceedingly great group of people to work with. And I'd have to say that, again, there was no competing among the people, rather much collegiality. Finally, the first DSP computers came along at the end of the 70s, and TI's famous Speak and Spell was the thing that sort of knocked everybody off their feet. To think that a DSP system, as complicated as it was on a single chip in a toy was just remarkable. And then later came the TMS 32010, and Tom Barnwell and Russ Mercer and I formed a small company to develop DSP hardware and software tools for the development of these. And that had a big impact on me and on all of us. Well, finally, again, returning, what are the pressing problems motivated by DSP development? What I'm about to show you, I don't think was a pressing problem 50 years ago. But DSP has enabled this and many of the other things that have been mentioned. This is a recent Saturday morning in Mountain View, California. I would say that about 80% of the people on the sidewalk were walking like this. Well, perhaps this is something that you might think of as being, be careful, you might get what you wish for. Anyway, congratulations to Rice. It's been great knowing all the people here, and I consider you all among my best friends.
Okay, let's thank Sidney and Al and Ron again.